All right, today we're going to continue with making table of values from an equation, except today we're going to go ahead and we're going to graph the ordered pairs that we create from the table of values. So let's get started with our equation, y equals negative 3x minus 2. We're going to substitute the first value of x, which ends up being negative 2. And so instead of negative 3 times x minus 2, it's going to be negative 3 times negative 2 minus 2. I like to circle what we're working on. A negative times a negative is a positive, but some of you more forget, so if you need to draw the multiplication triangle, you can. And you can see that a negative, again, times a negative is a positive, and we end up with y equals positive 6 minus 2. Now, I like to use War and Peace, and of course everybody knows that 6 minus 2 is 4, but I'm going to pretend that I think it's 8. So I'm going to go ahead and put positive 8, and I'm going to show you why later. So let's leave it as positive 8. All right, now we're going to continue with the next value of x. And we write our original equation, y equals negative 3x minus 2. And we're going to substitute negative 1 for x. So instead of y equals negative 3 times x minus 2, it's going to be y equals negative 3 times negative 1 minus 2. And I like to circle what I'm working on. A negative times a negative we know is a positive. 3 times 1 is 3. And then you bring down the rest and you end up with y equals 3 minus 2, which is positive 1. Now, when it comes to the 0 value of x, I told you guys that the Y-intercept is going to be the generic form of y equals mx plus b. And in this case, negative 2 is our b. And so that's the y-intercept. So 0 for x ends up resulting in a negative 2 value of y. And I call that a free point. And we will continue going over that later, but let me continue and continue with the remaining points or values of x. So again, we write our original equation down. Y equals negative 3x minus 2. And we're going to substitute positive 1 for x. Once again, we multiply before we subtract. So negative 3 times positive 1. A negative times a positive, a negative. 3 times 1 is 3. And then we continue with boxing our terms and using War and Peace. Negative 3 minus 2. Are they in the same gang or different gang? They're the same gang. So the answer is going to be negative. And when they are the same gang, you add the sign. So we end up with y equals negative 5. Lastly, let's do positive 2. And we substitute, instead of negative 3 times x, it's going to be negative 3 times positive 2 minus 2. In the order of operations, we multiply first before we subtract. And negative 3 times positive 2 is negative 6. I went ahead and boxed our terms. Negative 6 minus 2, war, peace. Peace, so they're negatives. And you end up with negative 8. And so we've completed our table. What we're going to do now is we're going to plot our points. Now, when we plot our points, we start off at the origin, and as you can see, I already plotted 2 points, and I'm going to go ahead and continue with the remaining points. And your graph should form a line, but if you were to connect these points, this would not form a line, would it? And so what happened is I made a mistake at that one point, so I'm going to go ahead and figure out, hey, what did I do wrong at that value of negative 2 for x? So I'm going to substitute negative 2 for x once again. And negative times a negative is a positive. 3 times 2 is 6. And so we end up with y equals 4. And so I erased my incorrect value, erased my point, and plotted correctly. And now you can see that the ordered pairs or points form a line. And there is my line. Once you complete your line, we need to label our points. And we label our points because that's how you're going to check your homework. We all should have the same ordered pairs, the same points, and that's how you know it's correct. Now the next example, we're going to have fractions. I taught you guys fraction busters. So here's our equation, y equals negative 1/6x minus 6. Now as you guys can see, I chose x values that are multiples of the denominator 6. So I chose 12. 6, negative 6, and negative 12 because those are going to bust the fractions. So let's substitute positive 12 for our first value. Now, we have fractions. Once again, we're going to multiply before we subtract. A negative times a negative is a positive, and the 6 and the 12 cancel out. You can see that 6 goes into 12 two times, and so you end up with a 2 over 1, which is 2. And we already had our negative sign, so we end up with negative 2 minus 6. We box our terms because we're subtracting, and when we subtract, we use war and peace. Are they at war? They're at peace. They're at peace, so your answer is going to be negative, and you add up the numbers. 2 plus 6 is 8, so we end up with negative 8. Let's continue with our second value of positive 6, our second fraction buster. We substitute 6, positive 6, we write it 6 ones. And now we're going to multiply before we subtract. A negative times a negative, negative times a positive is a negative, and the 6's cancel out. You end up with 1 once, so you end up with negative 1. And you bring down the rest, and negative 1 minus 6, they're at war or peace. They're at peace, so you have a negative answer. How many negatives do you have? 7 of them, so you end up with y equals negative 7, and you complete the table. Now, our freebie is going to be negative 6, 0, but I forgot the negative sign, and I completed my table correctly, and I just want to let you guys know that's what you guys just saw me do. So make sure you double check. And there is our y-intercept. When x equals 0, y equals negative 6. Now let's continue with the rest, the negative values. And we write our original equation. And y equals negative 1, 6. Instead of negative 1, 6 times x minus 6, it's going to be negative 6 times negative 6 minus 6. But we put our whole numbers over 1. We multiply before we subtract. A negative times a negative is a positive. I always like to put my signs down, and the 6's cancel out, so you end up with positive 1 minus 6. We box our terms because positive 1 minus 6, are they at war? They're at peace. They're at war. Who wins the war? The negatives. And by how many? 5. And so we end up with y equals negative 5 when x equals negative 6. Our last value that we're going to substitute is negative 12 for x. And we end up with negative 1, 6 times negative 12 over 1 minus 6 instead of negative 1, 6 times x minus 6. A negative times a negative is a positive. And you can see that the 6 goes into 12 two times. And so you end up with 2 once. And so you end up with positive 2. And you bring down the negative 6. And then we box our terms. We got 2 minus 6. When we add and subtract, we use war and peace. Are they at war? They're at peace. They're at war. Who wins the war? The negatives, and by how many? 4. And so we have completed our table, and now that makes ordered pairs. So let me go ahead and quickly plot the points. Now I've completed all 5 points. You can see my y-intercept, and that looks like a line. So let me connect the points. Does it form a line? Yes. And you want to double check your slope. If you look at the slope is negative 1, 6. So that means with a negative slope, our line should go down from left to right, and it does go down from left to right. Now we complete our final graph by labeling our ordered pairs. And again, that's how we check to make sure we all have the same graph. By labeling our ordered pairs and completing the graph. And this completes this second lesson today on graphing using a table of values from an equation of a non-proportional linear equation. Thank you.